Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Thanks so much for being here, those of you who are in the room with us and those of you who are on WebEx. If you're on WebEx with us today, just the usual reminders from me, please stay muted. If you want to be muted and with your camera off, if you want to have your camera off, and most importantly, if you have questions or comments for our speaker at any time, you can share them in the chat with everyone box, and I will ask them during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. And just a disclosure from the Planning Committee for Grand Rounds, the planners have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. And now I get to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Justin Bullock, who is a fellow in nephrology at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Justin is passionate about creating safe environments in medicine where everyone in the hospital is able to bring their authentic selves to work in the spirit of healing. Justin is a passionate medical educator, a teacher, researcher, and lifelong learner. I'll let him share the rest of his story, and we're so glad to have him here today. Welcome, Dr. Bullock. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very excited to join you all across the way here in Seattle. So I call this talk Re-Imagining Safety in the Learning Environment. And it has a mix of a lot of research that I and a lot of other people have been working on, and a little bit of blending sort of the personal with the professional and how that relates to safety in the learning environment. So feel free to put questions in the chat. If you have any burning questions as we're going, I'm happy to answer during. Okay, so I have no disclosures. I have three main goals for today. First, we will define the term identity threats, and we'll identify some common identity threats and how they impact learners in the workplace. Second, we'll compare intervening against identity threats to something called identity safety. And finally, we'll unpack this construct of identity safety and think about how we can leverage it to basically make safer learning environments. So I identify as a mixed methods researcher, which means I do both quantitative and qualitative work. And in that, in particular in the qualitative space, people will often talk about one's research paradigm. And I identify as sort of a baby critical theory scholar. And many of you have probably heard of critical theory recently in the news because critical race theory has been very kind of controversial or hot in many parts of the country. But I guess I want to step back and unpack critical theory as a whole. So the fundamental belief underlying all critical theory is that power is the key force that shapes society and social interactions. And in order to address disparities or inequities within society, we must attend to power. And in particular, what critical theories do is they link power to identities. So here you see just a few. There's critical race theory, which links power and race. Feminist theory, power and gender. Queer theory, power and sexual orientation. There's discrit, et cetera. There are many different forms of critical theory. With any theory, because I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about theory, a theory is only useful if it allows you to do work, if it helps to explain some aspect of culture or society that was previously not well understood. And so I want to give an example of what I think critical theory does for me. So I think many of you have probably seen some form of this image comparing equality to equity to justice, where equality is equally distributing resources regardless of one's starting point. Equity is unequal distribution of resources in a way that achieves an equivalent outcome. And justice is sort of redefining the game so that you don't have to allocate resources. And for a long time, I'd see this image, and it made perfect sense to me. And as I began to dive deeper into this critical theory space, I began to see a problem with this image. Inherent in it is that there's this tall person who's somehow physically superior, who would always be able to see the game regardless of any sort of societal support, and this physically inferior human being who basically could only ever see the game with support of society, and inherently creating this sort of ranking or hierarchy that some people are superior to others. And in reality, I love this image. This is from a psychiatrist named Nicolas Barcelo, and in this article, he basically argues that in reality, what we have are three equally competent individuals who are variably disenfranchised by society. And this perceived height difference actually reflects differential social circumstances. And to me, this is a subtle but very, very powerful point. And we know that within medicine, we see many of these disparities persist. We know that there's a very leaky pipeline to academic medicine leadership and throughout the whole sort of academic medicine training pipeline, that there are significantly fewer numbers of women and underrepresented minorities in leadership positions compared to those people who begin medical training. And this is even in fields where women are, even when you look at like chair numbers, even in fields like OBGYN, we have disproportionate numbers of male leadership despite the overrepresentation of women. And I'm very interested in understanding what are the forces that contribute to these types of disparities. So this figure is from a paper by Dr. Ariane Tehrani. She's at UCSF. That's where I was before I was here. And in this paper, she talks about something called the amplification cascade, where very small differences in assessed performance during core clerkships led to very big differences in honors awarded on rotations and ultimately in things like AOA Honor Society. And to unpack this, she uses a fishbone diagram. A fishbone diagram is a visual representation of the multifactorial contributors to undesirable outcomes. It's often used, my QI-related folks will recognize these. And in it, in this particular fishbone diagram, we see that Tehrani has shown that there are some forces here in the light blue which negatively impact or can negatively impact all individuals. And there are other forces which disproportionately impact some individuals more than others. These are things like unconscious bias, stereotype threat, healthcare inequities, and institutional responses to allegations of discrimination. And altogether, these things lead some people to have fewer career opportunities, advancement, less pay, et cetera. And so I want to unpack just one of these, which is stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a psychological phenomenon in which members of negatively stereotyped groups fear fulfilling those negative stereotypes about their groups. And that fear impairs performance. And so stereotype threat was first described at the University of Michigan in Women in Mathematics. And this is back in the 90s. And at the time, what researchers saw are that at entry-level math classes, men and women performed equivalently in math. And as you went up to the higher level math classes, men began to consistently outperform women. And there were some people at the time who would say, oh, women have just reached their ceiling, they just can't do math at the same high level that men can, et cetera, et cetera. But what researchers showed was by women being alone in these classes without other women, they were subconsciously or consciously primed of the stereotype that women are worse than men in math. And it turns out in what has since blossomed into hundreds and hundreds of studies, that in these conditions where people are primed to be reminded of these negative stereotypes, performance is impaired. And in these neutral situations where people aren't primed in the same way, performance improves significantly. And stereotype threat has since been described, and I mentioned women in math, Black and Latinx individuals in science and mathematics as well, elderly on tests of cognition, et cetera, et cetera. And we became interested in stereotype threat because we did a study because back in 2019 that where we were looking at medical students' perceptions of clerkship grading and of the learning environment. And one of the things that we were asking about is stereotype threat. And we found that as students had higher stereotype threat rating scores, they got fewer honors. And this is even after controlling for race. So we were very interested in unpacking this inverse association between stereotype threat and performance. And so we did another study, which basically was, I mentioned I'm a mixed methods researcher, was a mixed methods study involving a quantitative, just to describe the prevalence of stereotype threat by race or ethnicity, and then to qualitatively unpack it. And we care in particular about the qualitative portion because stereotype threat is a very context-dependent phenomenon. If you look at people of a given identities, in different contexts, they are stereotyped differently. And I will unpack what that means for us. So from this study, the first thing I'll say is we found very significant differences by race or ethnicity for one's, the scale was called, it's the stereotype vulnerability scale, for one's vulnerability to stereotype threat. While 84% of Black students were highly vulnerable to stereotype threat, only 4% of white students were. And that number was 45 and 43 for Asian and Latinx students, respectively. And as we interviewed people, there are a lot of really interesting questions that come from there. The first I'll say is, for the 4% of white students who were highly vulnerable to stereotype threat, as we interviewed them, it turned out that a lot of these students were actually Middle Eastern students who said, I'm white by US Census definition, but that's not my lived experience. So as we go through these interviews, we basically developed this 3-step model of how stereotype threat was manifesting, where first, learners were triggered by the colored lens of race or ethnicity. For us, that means, there was one learner who, on his first day of clerkships, walked into the hospital, and there was a staff member who said, oh, we don't have a lot of people your color in this area. And so from day one, as soon as he walked into the hospital, he was primed to know that he stood out for his race or ethnicity. People talked about things like microaggressions, there were some learners who said, nothing bad has happened now, but I'm just carrying all of the past experiences with me. After being triggered, learners then go into this very intense internal dialogue where they first, for things like microaggressions, they would say, am I being too sensitive? Did that actually happen, et cetera? They had to navigate the power dynamics, especially if a superior on their team was the person who sort of was inciting this triggering event. How to navigate that. They're always aware of the fact that they're being assessed by the people above them. And as a result, they talk about all the effort that they do to try and mitigate or prevent stereotype threat. One that stands out for me is there was one learner who basically said that she and her friend began to significantly overdress when they were on rotation so that they wouldn't be mistaken for cleaning or service staff. And I think this one quote really captures the impact of stereotype threat very well. So this is a learner who basically was asked a very sort of politically and racially charged question by their attending. And the learner said, do I want to give an answer that's going to appease them and maintain a good relationship? And it's a big loaded question when I'm trying to think of the differential for altered mental status. And what this learner is referring to first is this affective or emotional impact of having to deal with this. But second, they're talking about the cognitive load or the cognitive implications of these moments. And so this brings in cognitive load theory. So cognitive load theory basically says that we all have working memory, and this is the common, it can hold 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. We all have working memory, and that working memory is finite. And the working memory must accommodate 3 main things. First, the intrinsic difficulty of a task. So if you could imagine, the first time that you're learning to do a procedure, it is much more there's a much higher intrinsic load than the 100th time that you've done that same procedure. The extraneous load, which is the distracting information, which doesn't help you accomplish the task, but consumes your working memory. And the germane load, which is that part of our working memory which we use to create illness scripts, to unpack complex information, et cetera. And so what happens in stereotype threat is you overload learners' working memory with extraneous load. As this person says, that's a really complicated thing to think about as I'm trying to think of the difference for altered mental status. They're talking about this distractor information that's not helping them accomplish the task, but consuming their working memory. And you can imagine how over time, this could lead to, with repeated cycles of this can impair both learning and performance. And stereotype threat, in addition to overloading working memory, is thought to contribute to something called domain disidentification. When you study stereotype threat in all these different contexts, you find that the people who care the most about a given domain are most impaired by stereotype threat. So if I gave a science test to 100 students, and the students who don't actually care about science, their performance is not impaired by stereotype threat. It's precisely the people who most say, I want to be a scientist, I view science as some part of my identity, that are impaired by this performance. And again, medicine, this topic of identity is going to keep coming up, but becoming a physician or any healthcare professional is a process of identity formation. You're sort of integrating, you're going from a layperson to a healthcare provider. And over time, when people sort of have this chronic stereotype threat, what they do is they actually disconnect their identity from the identity that is under threat. And this leads to things like attrition. So as we were doing this study, at some point it became kind of sad because people were giving a lot of very challenging stories, and we began to sort of integrate this question of where did you feel safe from stereotype threat? And learners spoke about allies who did things like use these like microaggression or identity charge moments to become teaching moments, to correct misconceptions, to later reflect with the team. And so this made us interested in thinking about how we could intervene in this sort of stereotype threat cascade. And that brings us to microaggressions. So microaggressions are a term I suspect many of you, if not all, have heard of. But it often is, the language around it, I'm going to try and give you sort of the technical definitions of microaggressions. So microaggression is a behavioral, verbal, or otherwise environmental sort of indignity or slight towards some aspect of one's identity. It does not matter the intentionality of the person who is the source of the microaggression, but rather how it is received by the recipient. And again, I study a lot of the sort of social environment of learning, and many microaggressions, all microaggressions are socially situated. So for instance, it wasn't until Black lives mattered that all lives mattered. And so that phrase, this all lives matter, if I told you it like 10 years ago, it actually wouldn't mean anything. But it's very sort of socio-politically situated. And there are 4 main categories of microaggressions. I'll just tell you about 3. So one, there's a microassault. These are sort of the most flagrant forms of microaggressions. People often use the term macroaggression, and that actually is that's technically incorrect, because a macroaggression refers to a structural form of aggression. So the classic is like the Jim Crow laws are macroaggression, because they represent sort of structural racism, where microaggression reflects the interpersonal nature as opposed to the size of the aggression. There's micro-insult. These are things that often are unintended aggressions. So for instance, calling a female doctor a nurse, the word nurse is not an insulting word. It's actually a word that sort of signifies respect. But in the context of the sort of power hierarchy within medicine and someone who is sort of repeatedly entitled with a role that is not their own, it becomes a microaggression. And then finally, micro-invalidation, which is when one person invalidates the lived experience of another. So the classic is if an attending said, residents these days are so weak, back in my day, And so we know that microaggressions are, again, affectively and cognitively impactful. They're associated with worse mental health, with substance use, with changes in cortisol secretion, where people's HPA axes actually become activated and they have a physiologic response to these types of events. Okay, so, and I guess I didn't actually define the term identity threat, so I'll do that right now. So an identity threat is any way that one's identity is called into play in an unfavorable or harmful way. I've given you 2 examples of them, stereotype threat and microaggressions. And hopefully I've conveyed that they are impactful for multiple reasons. And so from this, I mentioned the stereotype threat study where microaggressions were a key trigger. We actually wanted to begin to think about how we can effectively respond to microaggressions. And I'm sure that many of you have heard different frameworks for how to intervene on microaggressions. But as you actually look through the literature and unpack them, you see that there's very, very little evidence base, if like to none, no evidence base behind the recommendations that different individuals give. So often what happens is there's an expert who studies some aspect related to identity threats or microaggressions, and they give kind of an expert opinion based on their lived experience, which is obviously so valuable. But we wanted to create a more robust evidence base underlying the ways that we would intervene against microaggressions. And as a critical theorist, I mentioned that I think about power, and so to best address issues related to power, critical theory would say that you go to the most vulnerable within a given community. And for us, those are medical students in the physician hierarchy, which admittedly is a very privileged hierarchy. So we basically asked medical students, we gave them 4 very realistic scenarios of microaggressions, kind of based on those sort of classifications that I gave you already. And we asked them, how would you feel most supported or protected in the event of a microaggression? Like, what would you want someone who saw this to do? And from this, we developed this bystander microaggression intervention guide, where we basically break up responding to microaggressions into a before, during, and after. And I would say for me, as a learner and at this point resident, I would say that I had some skills or sort of nuance around responding during and after, but doing something before to preempt microaggressions was new. So what learners talked about is there were moments where they had supervisors who would do things like, on the first day, you first sort of do your initial orientation, and at the end they would say, I want to spend a moment to talk about how we as a team can collectively support and protect each other. Identity comes up in many different ways in the learning environment, and sometimes there are things like microaggressions that come up. And I want to know what you would want me to do in the event of a microaggression. And so typically now, we do like whole workshops thinking about like how to do all these steps effectively. But when I would pre-brief, my general, and so we call this a pre-brief as opposed to a debrief. Pre-brief is an anticipatory conversation. So when I pre-brief, I would usually say, kind of give that intro and typically share some of myself. I'm someone who tends to be very kind of forward with my identities, and everyone is sort of different and does the pre-brief differently. But I would say I identify as gay and black and bipolar, and those identities come up in different ways in the learning environment. And if someone were to notice a microaggression or some moment that felt uncomfortable, I usually feel comfortable responding for myself, but there have been some times where I kind of get really stunned and don't respond, and in that case, I would appreciate someone from the team speaking up. And then what I do is I basically go around, starting with the most senior person, and say, attending such and such, because I'm still a fellow, attending such and such, it's like, how would you feel supported? And it actually creates this really cool moment where, I've had many attendings, one that I had one attending who was like a very senior person, very well respected, who basically told us that she still had like gender-based microaggressions now, like 30 years into practice. And it creates this opportunity to, and I always tell people, like, you don't need to share your identities, but if you would like to, you're more than welcome to. But it really creates this culture where everyone is responsible. There's not just one person. It's not just the senior person who's responsible, because sometimes that person is the person who's being harmed. And so there's a pre-brief, which for me was very new. During the microaggression, there's all sorts of trainings and frameworks for what to do in the moment. The two that I will sort of branch out, so first I'll say, if you haven't asked someone for their preferences, your default should be to respond. You should only not respond if someone has explicitly told you that they do not want a response. And to sort of unpack that, there are some people who just didn't have sort of faith that their team would be able to effectively respond in a way that that doesn't sort of highlight them even more. And so that is some people's preference, and if they express that, then you should respect that. And finally, there are some cases, particularly in the micro-assault versions, where you need to stop the interaction and allow the person being harmed to leave the situation. I would argue that there are very, very few circumstances in which you have these very flagrant interactions where the person who's being harmed staying there is helpful to de-escalate the situation. So what this looks like in real life is, one time I was in the ICU, I was presenting to my team, and a patient saw me, and then they began to repeatedly yell the N-word again and again and again. And no one on my team said anything, and I just was kind of stumbling through my presentation, like really struggling. And there was like no other black person anywhere in this entire ICU. And so it was very much an isolating experience. And eventually at the end, I had one of my co-residents who said, hey, let's go one unit over, so we're away from this. And I appreciate that person saying it then, but I also would have appreciated someone saying it in the moment. Because you can allow that person to leave and then de-escalate separately from them. And the reason why we work through these things is because if you haven't thought about it before, sometimes there's just this shock factor where everyone is sort of stunned and doesn't know what to do. And so you really need to rehearse these things over and over and over again to effectively respond. Okay, so we talked about pre-briefing before, and one thing that I forgot to say is, again, I will return often to power. Pre-briefing is an act of sharing power. So one, it allows the other people on the team to feel empowered for themselves to share their own preferences and how they would like you to respond. But it also empowers the person, the responder. It gives them informational power, so that they know what to do in the moment. And then finally, we'll say, after events happen, where I trained, the tendency was no one would respond in the moment. We would leave the room, and then someone would say, oh my God, I felt so uncomfortable. Like, can we please talk about this? Like, whatever. And what learners said was that was often, I'm forgetting the term, there you go, performative allyship. Sorry, that was often performative allyship, where people were sort of, they never actually made themselves uncomfortable, and then their response was not actually ended up being supportive. And so instead, what you should do is you should walk out of the room and one-on-one say, hey, I saw this thing happen, like, I'm sorry, like, do you want to talk about it? And if the person says no, then you just let it go. You don't bring it back up. If they say yes, then you can talk about it. So before, during, after, sort of intervening in 3 steps. So that was the first study. The second study that's on here was led by Dr. Megan O'Brien, who's a hospitalist at UCSF, where I was before again. And she basically did a second study where she interviewed faculty and gave them the same sort of scenarios and asked them how they would typically support students. Because recognizing that we want to create responses that are both supportive for learners, but also practical for the people who would typically be responding. When we did the initial study with learners, we asked people, who does this really well? And so we call those faculty skilled faculty. And then we invited everyone else, and we called people general faculty. And we basically compared how the skilled faculty responded compared to the general faculty. And there are many fascinating things about this, but the one thing that really stands out is that the skilled faculty were much more likely to talk about responding to microaggressions from a mastery-oriented perspective, where they would say things like, I know that I'm going to get it wrong, and I'm actually going to use those times I get it wrong as teaching moments for the team. So I'm going to show them like times where I didn't respond or didn't do things, and that it's this continual practice as compared to the general faculty who more often say, I really don't want to mess this up. Like, I'm really worried. I have a black learner. Like, I really don't want to, I know there's a lot of, pressure on this. Like, I don't want to, basically miss the shot. And so, there's future work, for us is going into unpacking and thinking about how people develop these skills to have this, intellectual candor where they're willing to show this vulnerability compared to this more sort of performance-oriented mindset. So we spent this we started spending time thinking about how we can intervene on threats. And over time, it became clear that intervening on threats is different from safety. That a mitigated threat, while it's better than an unmitigated threat, is a distinct entity from feeling safe. And again, critical theorists would say that centering identity threats centers the harmer, whereas centering safety would center the person who's more often harmed. And so I asked this question, what if we centered safety in the learning environment? So many of you have heard of psychological safety. It's basically the dominant safety paradigm that exists in medicine. And psychological safety is incredibly powerful. It does focus on power. And it says that in environments in which there is not a power hierarchy or power differential, people feel more safe to disclose errors, to challenge leadership, et cetera. And psychological safety has been very, is initially described by Amy Edmondson, has been very powerful in both education and the workplace, et cetera. I have 2 main critiques about psychological safety. I guess I'll call them loving critiques. The first is psychological safety is identity agnostic. So it disassociates identity from power. And how this looks is, in all of the literature around psychological safety, what it says is, once someone feels psychologically safe, then they'll bring their diverse identities, and then the team will benefit from having their diverse identities. And so it's first psychological safety, then diversity is good, or diversity will come. And what I would say is that doesn't represent the lived experience of many people, where identity is very fundamentally tied into the one sense of safety. And that they won't bring their diverse selves if they don't feel safe in their identities. And the second critique is that psychological safety, for the person to be to receive psychological safety, let's say we're focusing on Justin. So Justin is dependent upon everyone else to create psychological safety for him. It's never described that I can create psychological safety for myself. And in this way, it is not agentic. So there's the vulnerable individual who needs everyone else to make them safe, and then the sort of heroes who come in and save the person. And so this will come up as we talk about this concept of identity safety. So I argue that identity matters a lot. I spent this whole first half of the talk talking about identity threats. I mentioned this idea of professional identity formation, that the whole process of becoming a physician is a process of identity formation. The topic of professionalism is a very sort of controversial or sort of hot topic in medical education research, where we are now sort of interrogating the historical norms around professionalism and acknowledging that those norms were created when medicine was much more homogenous than it is today. There's this concept of identity dissonance. That's when who I am feels irreconcilable with who I am becoming, and that's contributing to people leaving medicine. And then finally, specialty selection. You'll often hear people say, go where your people are. And inherent in there is identity, that you're going to be with people who share identities that you do. And I certainly have a personal relationship to identity safety. I mentioned before that I have bipolar disorder, and I've lived in a medicine where I both felt identity safe for large portions and identity threatened for large portions. And here what I have depicted is, like a number of years ago, I wrote this piece that got published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so when it was sort of transactionally useful for sort of making the institution look good, bipolar was a strength, and everyone told me I was so strong and powerful and blah, 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 all these things. But then when I had the same condition that I talked about and patients were not impacted, the institution, I felt, harmed me. And this is something I spent a lot of time talking about. That's a separate thing. But really having this experience of previously feeling very identity safe and then feeling extremely identity threatened to the place where I was so anxious. I am not someone who, of my many mental health issues, anxiety is not one of them. But I turned into this place where I felt so anxious that if I made any mistakes that I would lose my license and get kicked out of the institution. It really was not safe to practice medicine. And I also didn't feel safe to come forward. And so for me, really existing and having this sort of this bipolar experience, one of very positive and one of very negative, really sort of informs the way that I think about safety. And so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about a paper that we had that just came out, which we called Yourself and Are Your Forms, a grounded theory exploration of identity safety in clinical medical students. And the background that I will give for you all is, as I was reading the identity threat literature, the term identity safety pops up. But it's a term that's really not consistently defined. There are some people who would say, there's stereotype threat that happened, and then you intervened against stereotype threat, and that's a identity safe condition. Which again, I'm going to challenge that. Challenge that assumption. So that's one way of viewing identity safety. And then there's one sort of small body of literature from studying elementary school students that basically talks about sort of some pillars of identity safety. And so we basically, again, it's a contextual phenomenon, wanted to understand how this looks like in sort of the caring professions within medicine, and to understand what it means to create safe spaces for people's identities. For those of you who are sort of med-ed nerds, we did constructivist grounded theory, which the whole goal of grounded theory is to make a theory that's grounded in data. And comparatively, there are some people who make theories who say, I think the world is like this, and then they go look for data to either prove or disprove that theory. What grounded theory does is we have a set of data, and then we create the theory from that represents the data. And so some people would say, a well-done grounded theory can never be disproven because for some subset of the population, it's true. And one of the important things about grounded theory is that you really sample sort of the edges for us relate to identity. So that means we interviewed people like the queer black woman immigrant, the trans Latinx person, and the person who self-identifies as a white male conservative. Because all of those people are important to understand our space. So, so I'm going to basically walk through the theory that we ultimately developed. So this is a learner who says, I'll play the game. For a couple of clerkships, I get the grades that I need. But at a certain point, I was like, this is not how I want to practice medicine. I want to do it in a way that feels true to myself and aligned with my identity, and not feeling like I have to hide certain parts of myself. So first, we're going to start with identity threat. We'll eventually work our way to identity safety. So a lot of the things around identity threat are not new. They sort of are well described in literature. People don't feel that their lives are welcome, that they have to change who they are to fit in. The two terms that I want to sort of highlight here, first, socio-political threat. So socio-political threat we use to mean the stuff that's happening outside the hospital impacts people inside the hospital. And the examples that our learners gave were, one, police killing of black people, two, anti-Asian hate, and three, this one was a very nuanced one for me, and sort of a good learning, is the person that I mentioned early on who identifies as white, male, and conservative, the topic of abortion came up. And he basically said, in the era of Roe versus Wade, it's not even that I want people to believe what I believe, but I feel that if anyone knew what my beliefs were, that one, my assessment would be penalized, and two, I would be socially ostracized. And that's identity threat, and that person is a white man. And so I think for me, this really challenges a lot of the sort of conventional dialogue and highlights that identity is a very complex, nuanced topic. And finally, lack of identity safety. And just one other point about that, as this person was speaking, I very much resonated with this experience of threat because for me, it felt consistent with how I experienced identity threat. And lack of identity safety are times where people would say, it's not even that anyone did anything mean or harmful to me, I just felt like I didn't fit in. And so this, it doesn't have to be actively harmful for someone to still not feel safe. So now we're going to look into thinking about responding to threats, which is sort of the middle portion of my talk that I mentioned. This is a learner who said, she's a Muslim woman who's talking about a time in the OR. And she says, I often wear my hijab in a turban style or like a scrub cap, but I'll always cover my neck. And I never had issues with that until a scrub nurse said that I can wear that. And then she talks about how a resident defends her and says, it's actually a part of her faith, this should be fine. And then she says, I really appreciated having someone in my corner in that moment. And even though the outcome was still that I had to change and wear something else, he apologized on their behalf. So I really appreciated that resident. So as this person was, giving this interview, this was a very kind of melancholia moment. And so what's happening in here is, I asked people, and did you feel safe? And the answer is no. So they felt that someone did something, they appreciated that someone did something, and they still would not call that safety. And so we term this threat mitigation, where you are mitigating a threat, but it's still present. And people can mitigate threats for themselves, or other people can mitigate threats for other people. And sometimes one of my, a very real example from a student that always sort of makes me chuckle is there's a patient who was doing something that was very kind of offensive to them, and they said, I don't, what I said to myself internally, this learner said, what I said to myself internally was, it's okay, that person's just stupid. And so they basically have these sort of we all have these internal sort of protective systems to help us when someone's committing an identity threat. Okay, so I spent all this time not saying what identity safety actually is, so now I'm going to tell you what it is. So identity safety refers to a state where someone can exist as their authentic self without worrying about others' impressions of their identities. And in identity-safe environments, people's identities feel valued, but it also empowers them to leverage those identities to improve patient care. And I want to really highlight this, that identity-safe environments improve patient care. And so I'm going to break this down. We have three main pillars of identity safety. The first pillar is what we call agency to serve. So agency to serve refers to times, and every learner gave examples of this, where people productively leverage their identities to help patients. So all of our learners give these very beautiful analogies and stories. And one person said, I compare my identities to holding a hand of cards. And when you walk into the room, there are some cards that are facing outward, that people already see those cards and those identities, and so I don't have the ability to hide them. But there are other identities that are facing me, that I can decide whether or not I want to play that card, if I feel like it's going to improve my relationship with a patient, et cetera. And so they really describe leveraging identities from this very sort of agentic perspective. I'm going to give you a very specific example. So this is a learner who has type 1 diabetes, and they're talking with their attending about another patient who has diabetes. And they said, their attending said, he doesn't seem like a very controlled diabetic, the patient. He's not really someone I think of as a candidate for an insulin pump. And the learner said, I got to kind of advocate, like, no, this is the standard of treatment. Everyone should be able to access this. I got to help advance patient care in that way. And my attending, I think, appreciated kind of learning from me in that aspect. And so what you see here is this person is leveraging their lived experience, their expertise in this topic, to both advocate for patients and to teach their attending. And fortunately, in this situation, this attending was very receptive to that. And what happens in the process of leveraging one's identities is, as you see, we're in the caring professions. As you see that your identity helps you to care for people, it brings value to that identity. It brings value to why you yourself are useful or valuable for existing in a given space. And so it creates safety for you and for patients. And I would say that sometimes people's agency to serve causes them to do things that question what we consider professional. And so this is a non-binary Latinx learner who basically was with a physician who was speaking to a patient in their not preferred language. And so they say, the doctor was speaking to this patient in English, just going off of the treatment plan, everything in English. I stepped in and started translating. I was like, I'm here, I'm gonna do better for this. And after that interaction, the surgeon basically, as we're walking on to the next patient, was like, don't do that again. There's a way we do things here and you need to stay in line. And so what this learner was doing is they were very clearly leveraging, they were doing agency to serve, they were leveraging their identity. And as I asked them, would you do it again? They said yes. That sometimes this desire to serve patients overrode, and this goes back to the topic of psychological safety. So this is a time where this learner is very clearly not psychologically safe, but because they have this agency to serve, this identity safety, they're actually overriding psychological unsafety. Next is upholding personhood. So upholding personhood refers to making individuals feel seen in their identities, that you value their identities, but you also see that there's a person beyond those identities. And I will just give an example because that will sort of make it pop, hopefully, this is a different non-binary learner. And to step back, a methodological topic is we very intentionally oversampled the people who have particularly marginalized identities in our learning environment. And so that meant that every person who was trans or non-binary, we invited to participate in our study, and that was 2 people. And also, I mentioned, the person who identifies white male conservative, a member of the LDS Church, that person is also marginalized in many ways in our community, and so we sampled them. So this is the second learner who we had who was non-binary, who said, one of the only female surgeons on the team took me out for coffee, and we talked about life, and it eventually led to gender stuff. She's like, I have a 1-year-old son. How can I teach him to enjoy exploring gender? That felt really respectful and caring. Like, I got to meet you, not I got to meet a trans person. And so one of the things that sort of the editors, as we were submitting our paper, brought up was asking, what's the difference between upholding personhood and tokenization? Because there are some people who would read this and say, I would be afraid to say something like this because I'm worried that people would think that I was tokenizing them. And to that, we returned to our data, and there's one learner who said, the times where I feel tokenized are when the only task I'm asked to do, this is a Spanish-speaking learner, is interpret for patients. And so for us, what tokenization means is if an identity is only valuable to the team in times where it's transactionally useful for patient care, that's tokenization. If the only time you care that someone is Mexican is when you have a Spanish-speaking patient, you're tokenizing them. But this surgeon is asking about their child, which is a very different, it's a very sort of intimate and less transactional, this learning experience is much less transactionally. And finally, belonging. Belonging refers to, people highlighted belonging when they felt that their identities were represented, that they fit in. There's both identity from visible concordance, but there's also times where there was visible identity discordance, but then after talking, getting to know someone, there turned out to be actual shared identities. And I would give, this is probably my favorite example from this entire study. which is, this is a purple scrunchie, and this is the story of the purple scrunchie. So this learner was a Filipino woman, and she talked about how she spent a year doing surgery research. And when she was doing surgery research, she said, like, she's not that they were mean to me, I just really didn't feel like I fit in. Like a lot of my hobbies are very culturally related hobbies, and I felt like I couldn't share those with other people. I'm someone who likes to have very colorful touches in my wardrobe. Like I have this purple scrunchie that I love to wear, and I didn't wear it for a whole year while I was doing surgery, because I just didn't see anyone else who was like doing things like that. And eventually she decides to not do surgery and switches to a different specialty, which she felt had more women and more diversity. And I said, "Did you ever go back to wearing that purple scrunchie?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Can you tell me about the first time?" And she said, "I put on my outfit, and I recognized that my outfit matched this purple scrunchie." And she like lifts up her water bottle, like, "See, I have this, like, I love like purple and pink, they're everywhere." And she says, "I look over at the purple scrunchie, and in that moment, I realized how much of myself I had suppressed over the last year." And it feels so silly to like talk about this like very small, like not important thing like a scrunchie. But it's just really nice to not have to overthink really dumb things like a scrunchie anymore. And so I love this story because I think it really captures all aspects of what it means, this seemingly very small things that significantly increase people's cognitive load and the difference that people experience when they're in places where they actually feel identity safe. So this is our model. We start with identity threat. Well, we really started with safety, but identity threat exists. We talked about that we need strategies to mitigate threats. I think one of the important things about identity safety, one critique that people often say is like, well, everyone's not going to be safe all the time. Like, we're not going to, we can't, like, that's not realistic to aim for. And what I would say is, one, I completely agree with those people that it is not possible to be identity safe all the time. That even if you were on a team where you created this perfect, like, amazing environment where everyone felt identity safe, you're going to walk around the hospital and you're going to interact with different people who are not a part of the team. And because people have different identities, you will have identity threats that are going to come up. And we need both to create a sense of identity safety and to have skills to mitigate threats. So the two are actually very complementary things that work together to create safe spaces. It's not that one is inherently more valuable than the other. But we cannot solely rely on mitigating threat and call that safety. So I have one more slide that I want to say. And I just want to think about, like, I said this at the beginning, a theory is only useful if it helps you do something. And so I would say, what does identity safety help us do? So the first thing is, identity safety, I argue, really challenges the narrative around who can create safety, and shows that even the vulnerable or marginalized in society, we know that they have to create safety because people exist in very toxic workplaces for a very long time, and there must be some way that they do that. And things like agency to serve, they help create identity safety. Obviously, there's limitations to what that can do, but learners are very much everyone is very much agentic in creating identity safety for themselves, and doing so actively improves patient care. We have some work that's going on where we're basically going to more unpack this because our learners gave so many different examples of the ways that they draw their various identities to help patients. And I think this is why diversity matters. Second, I mentioned this, identity safety does not mean that it's an environment with no identity threats. I think very importantly, upholding personhood really highlights this concept of bridging across differences. So a lot of the historical sort of dialogue is like, we need to recruit more black people so that we have black people to mentor the black people. But then what happens is, like, I'm in a division, now we have 2 black faculty. When I came, there was 1 black faculty. And I love that person, but it's like, what if I didn't? What if I came here and the only black person, like, we didn't get along with? Because not all black people like each other, and that's not like a bad thing. But what upholding personhood says is every single person can uphold someone else's personhood. And in so doing, we can make them seem valued and feel like they are part of, our greater unit. And I would say that attending to these factors of identity safety would, one, optimize performance for all. You would minimize cognitive overwhelm, cognitive load for people. It would promote equitable assessment, because you can't have equitable assessment with an inequitable learning environment. Even with a perfect tool, if the learning environment is inequitable, then you don't have equitable assessment. And finally, I mentioned this domain disidentification. I think if people felt identity safe, we would not lose so many trainees. So that is it. These are all my mentors. There are tons of them. Yeah, I would love any questions.
Thank you so much. Oh, look at all the people that came. Hi, everybody. If you have a question, I'll start with the people in the room. Feel free to raise your hand. And if not, I will look at the chat. Hello, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you so much for such a truly fantastic talk. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about the conversation that you have as the attending, for example, to set the stage for a new team that you're joining, to help address all of the issues that you talked about, but particularly the identity safety piece. So can you talk a little bit more about that conversation?
Yes, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yes, so the first thing that I would say is, I think some people, I would say the natural human tendency is to pre-brief when you see someone who has an identity that's I think they're gonna get microaggressed. But in so doing, you're actually you're microaggressing them, not you, but I do this too. There are times where I sometimes may think that topics related to identity are not going to be very salient, but in not doing it, so basically my practice now is I try to pre-brief with everyone, regardless of what the team looks like. And I've actually found I've been very humbled at my assumptions about people and things that people share. And it's really, it really makes me it puts a mirror up at me to think about how I am biased against thinking about different people. So first, that's the first thing I say is, one, I think you just have to do it, and I think the more you do it, the faster you get at doing it, and then the more you get your kind of way of saying it and doing everything. There was someone once said to me this assume good intent or whatever, assume positive intent, recognize or impact, and still, even if we sort of prioritize impact, there is a difference between someone who has good intentions and bad intentions. And so I think sometimes there's this fear of causing harm that is very paralyzing. And I very deeply believe that people can feel when someone has good intent versus when they're actively trying to be harmful. And so and part of it is there's so much vulnerability, because in many ways, the younger generation is way more skilled at, even I would say me compared to the med students now, they're way more versed and skilled in these things. And so it's very intimidating, because you have to sort of acknowledge this weakness. And in medicine, especially for people who have any minoritized identity, to push to have someone do something that's going to lower their sort of psychological size is hard, because there's oftentimes you walk out of the room, you're going to have tons of people who are going to lower your psychological size for you. And so there's a very complicated, dynamic. But that being said, I found it to be extremely, extremely powerful. I'm going to give an example of what I believe the impact of this is. I started, this is the point where I was a senior resident. I was feeling very comfortable. I was pre-briefing consistently, all these things. And we had this team that I felt was just a very high functioning team. And then there was a day where I just did a lot of things bad as a senior resident. And I was doing it in the spirit of wellness. We had a patient who was transitioning to comfort care from the ICU. And for me, in my head, I was this is a quick admit. We're going to fly through this, all these things. I harmed our team. And the next day I was talking with everyone. I basically said I feel I did a lot of things wrong, and I was reflecting on this last night, and I just want to talk about it. And our whole team was there, and there was one learner, everyone was debriefing, there's one learner who had been quiet for a long time, who then basically said, if that's what it means to be a senior resident, I don't want to ever be a senior resident. And when he said that, I was simultaneously like, oh, like gut punch in the stomach, but I was also so proud because there is no way that I would have, like, I have never felt safe enough to say something like that. And it definitely, the learners, like, I'm not saying that I created that all, like, the learner was clearly very strong to say these things, but also, like, when I think I feel like I've gotten much more, like, meaningful feedback. And, like, that feedback was, like, it was very helpful because I felt like I hadn't done it right. And, like, you know, yeah, for him to say, no, you actually did it bad, that was, like, helpful. Yeah, okay, that's my rambly answer.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was an excellent talk, and I took lots of notes. On the subject of pre-briefing and identity safety, in your research, have you found anything significant on the topic of micro-affirmations?
It's a great question. I'm trying to think of a good example. So I'll give you an example, and you can tell me if this fits. So one of the things that was very interesting are these moments. So one example I'm thinking of is there's a learner who, yeah, I don't know if this counts as a microaffirmation, which is what I'm like pausing about. So the short answer is going to be no, we haven't specifically looked. But I think like there's one time where a learner was with an attending who basically English was not their first language, and one person was presenting and like to a group of pathologists, and the pathologist basically wrote off the attending, and the learner afterwards they were talking with the attending, and the attending was like, oh, this happens to me all the time. I feel like they never, they don't. And the learner was basically like, no, I understood you. Like, I knew what you meant. You were trying to say this, like I heard you. And it's interesting because this is a flipped sort of moment. So yeah, I don't know if that counts as a micro-affirmation, but these small moments of like, of both sharing in the experience of being sort of invalidated because like people think they're less intelligent because, because of the way that they speak, but also feeling like seen in this like very brief, yeah.
Thanks for that example. I think the way it plays out mostly is that someone will mispronounce a word and then someone else on the team will correct them. And my theory is if you understood the person, then you don't need to correct them publicly.
Yeah. That doesn't come up very much in our. I have to. I need to. I will go back and. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
There's a great question in the chat, so I want to leave time for that. Thank you for your question, Dr. Actor, one of my colleagues. Thanks, Justin. I'd like to ask a question that touches on identity safety as well as what I would term socio-political safety. There recently was a conversation on Twitter, or X, about whether physicians wearing a pride pin would denote a political ideology versus whether this is more about identity and allyship. Similarly, there have been recent issues in the hospital regarding when healthcare workers are allowed to wear clothing emblazoned with a slogan that may similarly be taken as pride in one's identity and others may take as political ideology. An example of this would be a shirt that says, healthcare workers support blue lives, which may be understood as a direct opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm wondering your take on this as it's really tricky to navigate.
Okay. So I think the question is, I'm going to try and rephrase it and tell the person in the chat. I think the question is like, how much of our personal is okay to bring into the professional, and recognizing that different people will interpret those acts like differently. And I think that's a very, so one, I'm not going to give you, there's no line that I will ever be able to draw. I think what I would say is I think intention is very important here. So for instance, I would say the purpose of, like a rainbow pin or rainbow lanyard is to create both visibility and to say like you are safe here with these aspects of your identities. And I would say that shirt does the same thing. And then depending on the context, like, you may be affirming your patients in a way, obviously, for me, like, and I think the question is always, who is supported or helped by a given act and who is harmed? And as again, critical theorist, I would always like put it to like, who in society do we have most of like the duty to? And so like, this is gonna bleed very much into my like personal beliefs, and so I'm gonna acknowledge that and asterisk it. But I would say like, I don't view the police as a socially vulnerable or marginalized group, and so I I personally would have I know that I would have a stronger sort of aversion to that, but like maybe in certain contexts that is true. So yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a really hard question to ask you at 8:59, but I really appreciate your thinking through it. And thanks everybody for being here, both on WebEx and in the room. And thank you, Dr. Bullock, for all your work and making us think really hard this morning. Thanks so much.